A 5-year-old housekeeper's daughter whispered one sentence that froze a vampire king in his tracks and uncovered a betrayal no one in the court dared to notice. The central hall of King Draven Nightvale's citadel felt unusually still that evening, as though the entire fortress were holding its breath between the afternoon petitions and the night council session. Most courtiers had retreated to private chambers or darkened alcoves, their voices a faint murmur behind ancient tapestries, and the obsidian floors of the executive wing gleamed under the cold silver moonlight streaming through Gothic windows. In the middle of that polished silence sat 5-year-old Leora Greycloak, her legs dangling from a marble bench far too tall for her and her small hands clutching the hem of her worn gray dress. She wasn't supposed to be there. Children didn't belong in an immortal citadel full of ancient vampires, high ministers, and political strategists. But her mother's shift had started early that afternoon, and Tesha Greycloak, who worked as the royal housekeeper, had quietly positioned Leora on this bench with a single instruction whispered urgently, "Sit perfectly still, sweetheart. Don't touch anything. Be invisible." Leora had promised. She had promised to sit still, promised not to wander, promised to be as quiet as the shadows themselves. But sitting quietly was difficult when everything around her felt enormous and terrifying. The walls were covered in portraits of stern-faced vampire lords and ladies whose painted eyes seemed to follow her movements. The floor was so polished she could see her own small reflection, and she watched the moonlight dance across the black stone as she swung her feet ever so slightly, pretending the floor was a frozen lake and her shoes were skating across its surface. She was beginning to grow sleepy when footsteps echoed through the corridor, 2 sets, hurried and sharp, accompanied by hushed whispers that carried an edge of panic. Leora glanced up without moving her head too much, pretending she was still invisible. 2 men in dark crimson robes and polished boots rounded the corner, and one of them clutched a black leather scroll tube marked with the royal seal pressed in gold wax. She didn't know what the seal meant, but something about the way they acted, their glances over their shoulders, the tension in their movements, the way their voices dropped to urgent hisses, made her sit up straighter. Quickly, the taller one muttered, his voice like gravel. "He'll be in the signing chamber any minute." "I told you, he's detained with the border delegations," the other said, though he sounded far more nervous than reassured. "We just switch the decree and walk away. He'll sign it without thinking twice. The king hasn't checked a succession seal in 2 centuries. Leora blinked and leaned slightly forward, still unnoticed in the shadows of the oversized bench. The first man, Lord Vesemir, she would later learn, opened the black leather tube, scanned the parchment inside quickly, and slipped it out with practiced fingers. The second man, Minister Kale, passed him a rolled document that looked almost identical, except the parchment was a slightly different shade of gray, something Leora noticed only because the moonlight hit it differently. They worked with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment and the anxiety of someone who knew exactly how dangerous it was. Lord Vesemir sealed the tube again, his hands trembling slightly as he pressed the false document inside. "Done," he whispered, exhaling shakily. "The Shadow Court's puppet will be named heir by dawn. Let's go before anyone." Leora's heart thumped in her chest, not because she fully understood what was happening, but because she could feel that it wasn't supposed to happen at all. The men rushed past her without even glancing in her direction. They didn't see the little girl sitting as still as a statue in the shadows, watching them with wide hazel eyes. They didn't imagine that anyone as small and mortal as she was could matter. Leora stared down the hallway where they disappeared, her fingers curling around the fabric of her dress. She didn't know what a royal decree of succession was or why it mattered, but she remembered her mother's words from the night before, whispered while folding royal linens. "Important people make important decisions, Leora. One wrong paper signed by the king can change everything: life and death, peace and war." And now Leora realized she had just seen someone change the papers on purpose. A soft echo of boot heels rang from the far corridor, rhythmic and unhurried, yet carrying a weight that made the very air seem heavier. Leora's breath caught. King Draven Nightveil emerged from the shadows like a living storm, tall, impossibly still, his midnight cloak flowing behind him without wind, his silver eyes scanning the hall with the lazy precision of an apex predator. He moved toward the signing chamber, the black leather scroll tube his obvious destination. But then he stopped. His gaze swept the hall and landed on her, a tiny mortal child, trembling on a bench meant for ancient lords, her small face pale with fear and something else. Something urgent. King Draven's expression shifted, his predatory calm replaced by sharp curiosity. He changed direction, his boots clicking softly against the obsidian floor as he approached her. Leora's entire body went rigid. She had never been this close to the Vampire King. His presence was suffocating, ancient, vast, like standing at the edge of an ocean that could swallow her whole. He stopped 3 paces away, tilting his head slightly, his silver eyes narrowing. "You are Tesha's daughter." It wasn't a question. Leora nodded, unable to find her voice. "You should not be here alone," he said, though his tone was not unkind. "Why do you look at me as though the world is ending?" Leora's hands twisted the fabric of her dress so tightly her knuckles turned white. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her mother had told her to be invisible, to not cause trouble, to never, ever speak unless spoken to. But her mother had also taught her something else. Tell the truth, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Leora's small voice broke the silence, barely louder than a whisper, but clear as a bell in the still hall. "I saw them switch the scroll." King Draven froze. "Before we see what King Draven does next, do me a favor. My friend bet me $100 I can't get 1,000 subscribers this month. Every single one of you can make me win that bet right now. Subscribe and comment. You win, let's prove him wrong together." Tesha Greycloak arrived at a near run, her cleaning apron still tied around her waist, her face drained of all color. She had been summoned by a shadow guard with no explanation, only the chilling instruction: "The king requires your presence. Your daughter is with him." Her mind had filled with every nightmare a mother could imagine. Leora had touched something forbidden, broken some priceless relic, wandered into a restricted wing. She burst into the corridor and saw her daughter sitting beside King Draven himself, and her heart nearly stopped. "Your Majesty," Tesha dropped into a shaky curtsy, her voice breaking. "Please, I'm so sorry. Whatever she's done, I'll pay for it. I'll work extra shifts. Please don't." King Draven raised one pale hand, silencing her instantly. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was calm, measured, and entirely without anger. "Your daughter has done nothing wrong, Tesha Greycloak." Tesha blinked, confusion replacing terror. In fact, King Draven continued, turning his silver gaze back to Leora, "She may have just witnessed an act of high treason. And in doing so, she may have saved the entire realm." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Tesha's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Leora looked up at her mother with wide, anxious eyes, as if seeking permission to have spoken at all. King Draven gestured toward the corridor. "Come, both of you." They followed him through the winding halls of the citadel, Tesha's hand gripping Leora's tightly, until they reached the king's private office, a vast chamber lined with ancient tomes, maps of forgotten territories, and artifacts that pulsed faintly with old magic. At the center of the room stood Captain Aldrich of the Shadow Guard, his armor gleaming darkly in the candlelight, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. King Draven wasted no time. "Captain, activate the security crystal. I need the magical memory of the Eastern Corridor outside the signing chamber." The last 30 minutes. Captain Aldrich's eyes widened fractionally, a rare show of surprise, but he obeyed without question. He retrieved a smooth, palm-sized crystal from a locked cabinet and placed it on the obsidian desk. With a whispered incantation, the crystal began to glow, and the air above it shimmered. An image materialized, translucent but perfectly clear, showing the exact corridor where Leora had been sitting. Tesha gasped softly as she watched the scene unfold like a ghostly play. There was Leora, small and still on the marble bench. Then came the two figures in crimson robes, hurried and furtive. Leora's hand tightened around her mother's as she watched Lord Vesemir open the black leather scroll tube, remove the original parchment, and replace it with the forged decree. Minister Kale's nervous glance over his shoulder. The whispered exchange, "He'll sign it without thinking twice." The crystal's memory was flawless, capturing every detail, the difference in the parchment color, the trembling hands, the guilty urgency. King Draven turned to Leora, his voice quiet but firm. "Is this exactly what you saw?" Leora nodded, her voice small but certain. "That's exactly what I saw." King Draven straightened, and for a moment, the weight of centuries seemed to settle over his features. He looked at this child, this mortal, fragile child, and saw something he had not encountered in decades, undeniable, uncorrupted truth. No immortal could manufacture such sincerity. No courtier could feign such innocent precision. She had no agenda, no ambition, no reason to lie. She had simply seen, and she had simply spoken. He turned sharply to Captain Aldrich, his voice hardening into the command of an absolute ruler. "Detain Lord Vesemir and Minister Kale immediately. Full magical restraints. I want them bound, silenced, and held in the lower vaults. No contact with anyone outside this room." Captain Aldrich bowed deeply. "At once, Your Majesty." And Aldrich, King Draven added, his tone darkening further, "launch a full investigation into their connections with the Shadow Court. I want names, locations, correspondence, everything. This was not the work of two fools acting alone." "Understood." Captain Aldrich vanished in a swirl of shadows, moving faster than mortal eyes could follow. The silence that followed was heavy. Tesha stared at her daughter as though seeing her for the first time, her mind struggling to comprehend that this small girl had just unraveled a conspiracy that could have toppled a kingdom. King Draven knelt slowly, bringing himself to Leora's eye level. His silver gaze was no longer cold, it was something closer to wonder. "You did well, little one," he said quietly. "Better than any of my generals. Better than my entire court." Leora's lips trembled into the smallest of smiles, and for the first time that night, she felt like maybe, just maybe, being seen wasn't so terrifying after all. The brave little Leora exposed the treason. But what was the true motive behind the ministers trying to switch the royal decree of succession? Was it just greed, or something darker that threatens the entire kingdom? Someone told me people don't finish full story videos anymore. If you're still here, subscribe and comment how many minutes you've been watching. Let's prove short attention spans are a myth. Within the hour, the inner royal council had been summoned. The war room deep within the citadel's fortified heart filled quickly with the kingdom's most powerful figures, ancient vampire lords, the High Magistrate, the commander of the Northern Legions, and the mistress of the royal treasury. They entered with expressions ranging from curious to irritated, and used to being ended with such urgency outside of active invasion or catastrophic disaster. King Draven stood at the head of the obsidian table, his presence alone enough to silence the murmured speculation. In his hands, he held two scrolls, one genuine, one forged. The black leather tube sat between them like evidence at a trial. "We stand at the edge of civil war," he began, his voice cutting through the room like a blade through silk. Or rather, we stood there. Less than an hour ago. The council members exchanged glances, confusion rippling through the chamber. King Draven laid both scrolls flat on the table. "This," he said, gesturing to the first, "is the true royal decree of succession, naming my chosen heir according to the bloodline protocols established 4 centuries ago." He paused, letting the weight settle. "And this is the forgery that was meant to replace it." He unrolled the second document. The room leaned forward collectively. The mistress of the treasury was the first to speak, her voice tight with disbelief. Who would dare? Lord Vesemir and Minister Kale, King Draven said flatly. Both have been detained and are currently bound in the lower vaults under full magical restraint. A shocked silence fell over the room, broken only by the hiss of indrawn breath. These were not minor functionaries. These were trusted advisors, men who had served the crown for decades. The forged decree, King Draven continued, his tone glacial, would have named Lord Corvin of the Shadow Court as my successor. A puppet. A false heir with no legitimate claim. He let that sink in before delivering the killing blow. The moment I entered my centuries of sleep, as is my right and cycle, Corvin would have assumed the throne. The true heirs would have challenged him. War would have been immediate, brutal, and absolute. The realm would have burned. The High Magistrate's hands trembled as he reached for the forged document, studying the falsified seal with horrified fascination. The craftsmanship is flawless. I would not have caught this. None of you would have, King Draven said, and there was no accusation in his voice, only cold fact. I would not have. I was moments from signing it myself. Then how the commander began. King Draven raised a hand. I was alerted by a witness whose honesty was beyond reproach. Someone we all overlook. He met each of their gazes in turn, his silver eyes burning with quiet intensity. Someone so far beneath our notice that we forget they see everything we do. He did not name Leora. He would not expose her to the political maneuvering and potential retaliation that might follow. But his message was clear, and the council members understood. The palace was full of unseen people, servants, staff, those who moved through the halls like ghosts. From this moment forward, King Draven said, his voice hardening into command, we conduct a full audit of every document, every seal, every decree issued in the past year. I want the Shadow Court's network exposed and dismantled. And I want every member of this council to remember that power makes us blind. The meeting continued for another hour, voices rising in heated debate, strategies proposed and discarded, anger and fear filling the chamber like smoke. Outside, in the narrow alcove where Tesha had been told to wait with Leora, the little girl sat on her mother's lap, her hands pressed over her ears. The voices booming through the thick stone walls were deep, furious, and terrifying. Leora couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the rage, and her small heart clenched with guilt and fear. I made the king angry, she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. I caused this. Tesha held her tighter, stroking her hair. No, sweetheart. You didn't cause anything. You stopped something terrible. But Leora couldn't shake the feeling that she'd done something wrong, that her small voice had unleashed a storm she didn't understand. The heavy door finally opened, and King Draven emerged, his expression carved from stone. But when he saw Leora, her tear-streaked face, her wide, frightened eyes looking up at him as if silently begging to know if the danger was truly gone, his expression softened. He lowered himself to one knee, bringing his face level with hers once more. The gesture itself was extraordinary. Kings did not kneel. But Draven Nightvale did, and he did so without hesitation. You are not in trouble, Leora, he said gently, his voice stripped of all its earlier steel. Do you understand me? Leora nodded, but her lips still trembled. What you did tonight, King Draven continued, was not trouble. It was the most vital courage I have seen in centuries. You told the truth when it was difficult. When you were afraid. That is a quality stronger than any sword, rarer than any magic, and more valuable than most of my courtiers possess. Leora's tears slowed. She searched his face, looking for any sign of deception, but found only sincerity. The danger is gone, King Draven said quietly. Because of you. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Leora believed him. King Draven led them to a smaller, quieter chamber adjacent to the war room, a private sitting room rarely used, with tall windows overlooking the moonlit gardens and furniture that felt almost intimate compared to the vast halls of state. He gestured for Tesha and Leora to sit, and then, to Tesha's utter shock, he sat across from them not on a throne, but on an ordinary chair, as though they were equals meeting for counsel. For a long moment, he simply looked at them, mother and daughter, mortal and fragile, dressed in simple clothing that marked them as part of the palace's invisible workforce. Then he spoke, and his voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with truth. Without Leora, the dynasty would have fallen within the hour. Tesha's breath caught. She had heard pieces of what had happened, whispered hurriedly by the Shadow Guard, but hearing it stated so plainly by the king himself made it real in a way that terrified her. King Draven leaned forward slightly, his silver eyes fixed on Tesha with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. "You have served this citadel for years, Tesha Greycloak. You have cleaned these halls, maintained these chambers, ensured that the heart of my kingdom ran smoothly. And I never saw you. I never knew your worth beyond your duties. I never even knew your name until tonight." Tesha stared at him, unable to find words. Kings did not apologize. Kings did not reflect. And they certainly did not admit fault to someone like her. "That is my failure," King Draven continued, his tone edged with something that might have been shame. "Not yours. Mine." Tesha finally found her voice, though it was barely above a whisper. "Your Majesty, we people like me, we're used to being shadows. It's how we survive. We keep our heads down, do our work, and stay out of the way. That's just how it is." "It should not be," King Draven said, and there was a finality in his voice that made it clear this was not a mere sentiment, but a declaration. "It will not be. Not anymore." He rose and walked to the window, his silhouette framed by the pale moonlight. "I have ruled for centuries, Tesha. I have commanded armies, negotiated treaties, outlasted rivals and enemies. But somewhere in all those years, I stopped seeing the people who made my reign possible. I stopped noticing the hands that built the stability I took for granted." He turned back to face her. "Your daughter reminded me that power without awareness is blindness. And blindness nearly cost me everything." Leora, sitting quietly beside her mother, watched the king with wide eyes, not fully understanding the magnitude of his words, but sensing their importance. King Draven returned to his seat and met Tesha's gaze directly. "I am offering you a formal appointment to the royal household. Not as a contract laborer, but as a permanent member of my personal staff. You will have protected quarters within the citadel grounds, a private residence for you and Leora. Your pay will reflect the true value of your service, and you will have the security and respect that should have been yours from the beginning." Tesha's hands trembled in her lap. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Your Majesty, I don't know what to say." "There is more," King Draven said, and now his gaze shifted to Leora. "I am establishing a fund in your family's name, the Greycloak Fund. It will be a perpetual magical education scholarship, beginning with Leora and extending to any future children of your line. She will be trained by the finest tutors in the realm. She will learn magic, history, strategy, governance, everything necessary to ensure her future is one of power and learning, not invisibility." Tesha's composure finally broke. She covered her face with her hands as tears streamed down her cheeks, tears of disbelief, of relief, of a hope she had never dared to imagine. Her shoulders shook as she tried to hold back the sobs, but they came anyway, quiet and overwhelming. Leora reached up and gently touched her mother's arm, confused but sensing that these were not tears of sadness. King Draven remained still, giving Tesha the space to absorb what had just been offered, not as charity, but as restitution, as recognition. When Tesha finally lowered her hands, her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes were clear. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you, Your Majesty." King Draven inclined his head, a gesture of respect he had not offered to anyone in longer than he could remember. "No, Tesha Greycloak. Thank you. You raised a daughter brave enough to speak when silence was easier. That is a greater gift to this kingdom than you will ever know." And in that quiet chamber, Beneath the cold light of the moon, 3 lives were forever changed. The investigation into the treason consumed the citadel for days. Shadow Guard operatives moved through the halls like wraiths, interrogating witnesses, tracing correspondence, dismantling the Shadow Court's network thread by thread. Names were uncovered. Safe houses were raided. The scope of the conspiracy grew darker and more complex with each passing hour, revealing a plot that had been years in the making. But through it all, King Draven found himself returning to a single image, a small girl sitting perfectly still on a marble bench, her legs dangling, her hands clutching her dress, her eyes watching what no one else had bothered to see. That image grounded him. It reminded him that all his power, all his ancient strength and political cunning had nearly been rendered meaningless by his own detachment. Leora's innocence had cut through the chaos like a blade, bringing clarity where there had been only routine and assumption. And so he began to watch. He noticed the young man who polished the floors of the throne room each morning, working with quiet precision, his movements almost meditative. He saw the elderly woman who tended the citadel's gardens at dawn, her gnarled hands coaxing life from the soil with a care that bordered on reverence. He observed the kitchen staff, the stable hands, the clerks who copied documents in cramped offices lit by candlelight. Faces he had ignored for decades, some for centuries, suddenly came into focus. And with them came the realization of just how much untapped loyalty existed within these walls. These people served not out of ambition or the promise of power, but out of simple, steady dedication. They were the foundation upon which his entire kingdom rested, and he had never truly seen them. 3 days after the attempted coup, King Draven sent a personal summons to Tesha and Leora, inviting them to his private chambers. Not the war room. Not a formal audience hall. His personal chambers, a space few mortals had ever entered. When they arrived, escorted by a respectful shadow guard, King Draven greeted them himself, opening the heavy door and gesturing them inside. The room was vast, but surprisingly warm, filled with shelves of ancient books, maps spread across tables, artifacts from forgotten ages displayed with reverence rather than ostentation. Tesha hesitated at the threshold, still uncertain of her place in this new reality, but Leora's curiosity overrode her fear. Her eyes went wide as she took in the towering bookshelves, the leather-bound volumes with gilt lettering, the strange and beautiful objects that seemed to hum faintly with old magic. King Draven watched her reaction with something close to fondness. "Do you like books, Leora?" She nodded shyly. He walked to one of the shelves and carefully retrieved a large, ancient tome, its cover embossed with silver runes. He brought it to a low table and opened it gently, revealing illuminated pages filled with illustrations of mythical creatures and flowing script in a language Leora couldn't read. "This," he said quietly, "is one of the oldest books in my collection. It was written before the citadel was even built." He gestured for her to come closer, and she did, her small fingers hovering just above the pages without touching. "Power makes us blind, Leora. The more we have, the less we notice. But sometimes it takes the eyes of a child to notice the poison on the page." Leora looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. Then, in that innocent, direct way only children possess, she asked, "Will the bad men hurt your crown?" King Draven paused, considering how to answer. He could have deflected, could have offered a reassuring platitude. Instead, he chose honesty. "The crown was in danger," he said, kneeling so they were eye to eye. "Great danger. The kind that could have destroyed everything I've built, everything this kingdom stands for." He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "But it is safe now. Do you know why?" Leora shook her head. "Because my bravest subject saved it." Her eyes widened. "Who?" "You, Leora." She blinked, the weight of those words settling over her like a cloak too large, but somehow fitting. She didn't fully understand the politics, the bloodlines, the centuries of history at stake. But she understood that she had done something important. Something that mattered. Tesha stood nearby, watching this exchange with tears threatening to spill once more. She saw her daughter, her small, quiet, overlooked daughter, being treated not as an inconvenience or a charity case, but as a person of worth, of value, of consequence. King Draven rose and turned to Tesha. "This is not a reaction to a crisis," he said firmly. "This is a change. A correction. You and Leora will always have a place here. Not in the shadows, but in the light." And in that moment, Tesha understood that their lives had not simply improved, they had been fundamentally transformed. They were no longer invisible. They had been seen. Days later, the full weight of the transformation settled across the citadel like fresh snow, quiet, pervasive, and undeniable. The investigation had concluded with devastating efficiency. Lord Vesemir and Minister Kale were being held in the deepest vaults, awaiting formal trial before the High Court. 3 additional conspirators had been identified and arrested. The Shadow Court's network within the palace had been dismantled, root and branch. But beyond the arrests and the political fallout, something else had shifted, something harder to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Tesha Greycloak stood in the administrative wing, her hands trembling slightly as she accepted the leather-bound document from the royal steward. It was her official contract, stamped with the king's personal seal, signed in his own hand. The words were almost too overwhelming to absorb. Permanent appointment, protected status, annual salary that was more than she had earned in the past 5 years combined. And at the bottom of the contract, a single line that made her breath catch: residence, Greycloak Manor, East Gardens Quarter. She had her own home now. Not a cramped shared room in the servants' wing, not temporary housing dependent on her continued employment, but an actual manor, small, modest by noble standards, but hers. Hers and Leora's. A place where they could build a life without fear of eviction, without the constant precariousness that had defined their existence. The royal steward, an older vampire with silver hair and kind eyes, smiled gently. "The house has been prepared for you, Mistress Greycloak. You may move in at your convenience." Mistress Greycloak. Not the housekeeper. Not Tesha from the evening shift. A title. Recognition. Respect. She managed a shaky thank you and left the office in a daze, clutching the contract to her chest as though it might vanish if she let go. Meanwhile, Leora walked through the halls of the citadel with a new, quiet sense of belonging. She no longer pressed herself against the walls when nobles passed. She no longer made herself small and invisible. She still moved carefully, still observed more than she spoke, but there was a difference now, a subtle straightening of her spine, a lift to her chin that hadn't been there before. The palace staff noticed. Some smiled at her. Others nodded in acknowledgement. Word had spread, in the way these things always do, that the little girl with the golden hair had done something extraordinary. The details were vague, carefully guarded, but the respect was real. 2 evenings after Tesha received her contract, King Draven extended a personal invitation for them to join him in the formal dining hall, a space traditionally forbidden to mortal staff, reserved exclusively for royalty and high-ranking nobles. Tesha had walked past its ornate doors 1,000 times and never once imagined stepping inside. But now she did, her hand holding Leora's, and the vastness of the hall took her breath away. The vaulted ceiling was painted with constellations that seemed to move. The long table was set with silver and crystal that caught the candlelight like captured stars. King Draven stood at the head of the table, dressed simply but elegantly, and he smiled a rare, genuine expression as they entered. "Please sit." The meal was quiet, intimate despite the grandeur of the setting. They spoke little, but the silence was comfortable rather than awkward. Toward the end, Leora reached into the small pocket of her dress and pulled out something she'd been working on in secret for days, a small flower crafted from folded paper, its petals carefully creased and shaped, painted with watercolors she'd borrowed from one of the palace clerks. She held it out shyly. "For you." to say thank you. King Draven accepted it with a reverence usually reserved for sacred relics. He studied the delicate craftsmanship, the imperfect but heartfelt artistry, and something in his ancient chest tightened unexpectedly. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. "I will treasure it." He rose and walked to the grand fireplace that dominated one wall. On the mantel, among priceless artifacts and centuries-old heirlooms, he carefully placed the paper flower in a position of prominence. It looked absurdly fragile among the surrounding grandeur, but somehow that made it more precious. When he returned to the table, he carried a sealed scroll. He placed it before Tesha and Leora. "This formalizes the Grey Cloak Fund, a perpetual endowment for Leora's magical education, managed by the Royal Treasury, protected by royal decree. She will begin her studies when she turns 7 if she wishes, with the finest tutors in the realm." Tesha's eyes filled with tears again, but she blinked them back, determined to hold herself together. King Draven knelt beside them, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at Tesha first. "This is not a reward. It is a debt." Then his gaze shifted to Leora. "You didn't yet know how to fear the powerful. And, because of that, you saved us all." He placed a hand gently on Leora's shoulder, and in that moment, he felt the truth of what had happened settle into his bones. She had not just saved a decree or prevented a coup. She had pierced the cold heart of his immortal arrogance. She had reminded him that vigilance required humility, that connection required presence, and that power without awareness was merely waiting blindness. "Thank you, Leora Greycloak," he said softly, "for seeing what I could not." Leora looked up at him with those wide, honest eyes and smiled, a small, shy smile that carried no agenda, no calculation, only the simple warmth of a child who had been seen, valued, and believed. And King Draven realized that their lives were now quietly, irrevocably, and permanently intertwined. Not as ruler and subject, but as something deeper, something built on trust, honesty, and the fragile, fierce courage of a little girl who refused to stay silent. If you enjoyed this journey into the Citadel, before you go, I need your help. I told someone special that real storytelling still matters and people will subscribe. If I was right, prove it. Subscribe and comment. Storytelling matters. Don't let me down. Subscribe and turn on notifications for the next story. Thank you very kindly.